You are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke Makenna, but today's case is the Mad Axeman of New Orleans. Now this one is unsolved and will definitely get you thinking. There is so much evidence in this case, which is why it's so frustrating. There's not only a strange MO, there's also a super strange letter written to police, and also multiple suspects that can only ever be theorized. This one is definitely a murder mystery, multiple murder mystery at its finest. By the way, I post so much content like this, so if you would like to just subscribe and join my little family and hear these victim stories, then I would absolutely love to have you here. Now let's get back to the story. So it was 1918 in New Orleans, Louisiana, and that May the killings would begin. Or so it's theorized that they begun at this time. It was May 22nd, and a family named the Maggio family were in their homes when they were attacked. It was a home on the streets of Upper Line and Magnolia Streets, and there lived Joseph Maggio and his wife Catherine. They were both asleep when this intruder cut the bottom panel of their back door with a chisel and came inside. When they were asleep, he went over to their bed and cut the couple's throats with a razor blade, and before leaving, bludgeoned them with an axe. Catherine was nearly decapitated and already deceased by the time they were found, but Joseph was actually still clinging to consciousness when his brothers, who lived next door in the same house to them, heard the moaning and decided to come check on them. Joseph was only clinging to consciousness and couldn't tell them anything about what he had seen, what the intruder looked like, or anything, and he died several minutes later. But the intruder did leave evidence behind. And when investigators got there, they found clothes, but they did not belong to the Maggios in the house, covered in blood, as though this intruder had changed clothes. There was money and valuables at the crime scene that hadn't been taken, so it was ruled out that it was a robbery, but they also didn't really look around that much because fingerprints were super new, and so they thought that really searching was frivolous to the actual investigation. But when a bloody razor was found near the Maggio's house on a neighbor's lawn, that is when they decided to use that evidence to look into someone, because they now officially had a suspect. That razor belonged to Joseph's brother, Andrew. You see, Andrew Maggio, he worked at a barber shop, and his boss said 2 days prior to the murder he had taken that blade home to get a nick out of it. They didn't really know exactly if that was the reason. When investigators asked him, "Where were you that night?" asking him for an alibi, he said he was out celebrating the night prior, that he was going to join the Navy and was about to be shipped out. And so he was celebrating that with some friends and drinking, and he said that that's why he was unable to hear anything going on, because he was too intoxicated. But police didn't necessarily believe him. Andrew had also told them that he had seen an unknown man lurking near their property a little while before the murders, and when he started hearing strange groaning noises through the wall that night, that's why he went to check on his brother and his wife. The investigators had no evidence to hold him, and so they actually had to release him, which they realized was probably a good idea when they found another startling clue that pointed to a possible other suspect. Because a block later, on a sidewalk, had a phrase written on it saying, "Miss Maggio will sit up tonight, just like Miss Tony." And it seemed to be written in children's handwriting. It would be a month later when the next attack would occur on June 28th at the corner of Georgiunos and La Harpe Streets. And this was the residence of a Louis Bazumers, and he actually had a grocery store where he lived. So his quarters were in the back and his grocery store was at the front. And there was a man named John Zango, who was a baker who would bring some bread for the grocery store. And he brought it at 7 a.m. that morning to just drop off some bread when he found the bodies. He found Louis Besmer and his mistress, Harriet Ann Lowe, in a pool of their own blood. And when investigators got there, it was found that Louis had been struck on the right ear and Harriet below the left ear. The bottom panel of their bedroom door had been chiseled out, and the bloody axe was found in the bathroom. This bloody axe had belonged to Louis, and when Louis was investigated, because he was still conscious when investigators came, he told them that he was asleep when he was attacked. Harriet Ann, however, only survived 7 weeks after the attack, but she did go to the hospital and she regained consciousness, and at this point she told investigators the story of the events of what had happened that she remembered. And she said that a man with one white parent and one black parent, she used a derogatory term for that, I'm not going to use that, but she was explaining a man with one black parent and one white parent had attacked her. And so this is what investigators started to look for. And that's when they came across Louis Ubicon, a 41-year-old African-American male who had previously worked at Louis's grocery store. When brought in for questioning, did not have a full conclusive statement. He was going back and forth. He didn't know where he was that morning. And so it made him look super guilty. And back in that time, being a person in color, you were not treated fairly in the slightest. And same goes in some cases today. But back then it was very bad. And so the fact that he was an African-American male meant that basically anything he said didn't matter, and he would be implicated in these crimes if they didn't find anything else. But thankfully, with no evidence to actually connect him to these murders, they moved on and they got their next suspect from evidence found at the crime scene. But it was the victim's evidence. So Louis Bessemer, the victim, he had letters in his trunk that were written in German and Russian and in Yiddish. And so investigators started to believe possibly he was an international spy, a German spy. With this, they went to Harriet and asked her if she knew anything about this, where she basically said she believed he was one as well, and so he was arrested. For not only that, but the attack on his wife. But after 2 days, he was released, and then the investigators working on this case were actually let go and demoted for unacceptable police work. But then it took until August for Harriet Ann Lowe to finally say something that implemented someone in this crime, and that was her own lover, Louis Bessemer, because she said that a month prior to the actual attack that ultimately would kill her, Louis Bessemer had actually attacked her with an axe, and this was enough to arrest him. But unfortunately, after serving 9 months in jail, he was acquitted at trial. The next attack happened on August 5th on Elmira Streets, and this was the same day that Harriet Ann Lowe passed away. This was the Snyder Residence, and Ann was 8 months pregnant at the time, and her husband was actually not at home. He was at work. But when he came home at midnight, he found Anna with her face covered in blood and her scalp cut open. Several of her teeth had been knocked out, and she was rushed to the hospital, where 2 days later she regained consciousness and could tell them what she remembered. And she said she remembers waking up from a nap to see a dark figure looming over her, and then kind of the glint of some shiny object that was thought to be an axe hitting her over the head repeatedly. There had been nothing stolen other than $6 or $7 from Ed's wallet, and no sign of forced entry, and investigators didn't believe that this was connected to the previous attacks that had happened, and believed that she wasn't actually hit with an axe but a lamp from the bedside table. They even arrested an ex-convict named James Gleason, who actually ran from them when they were trying to get him. When they finally did, they arrested him but ultimately released him because they had no evidence against him. And he told them the only reason that he ran was because he'd been to jail so many times previously and didn't want to go back, not that he actually did it. Thankfully, Anna Snyder and her baby survived, and she had that little baby, a healthy baby girl, a week later. But this was yet another unsolved case in the area, and investigators were finally starting to put it together, but so was the public, meaning the people were very scared. It was now August 10th, 5 days later. Pauline and Mary Bruno had heard commotion in the next room where their elderly uncle Joseph Romano had lived. And when they walked out, they actually came in contact with the intruder before rushing in to see that their uncle's head had been sliced open 2 times by an axe. And these were the only 2 thought to have gotten so close to the attacker thus far without actually being attacked. And they did have a description. They said that he was dark-skinned but yet still white. He was heavy-set. He was wearing a dark suit and a slouched hat. The house had been ransacked and yet nothing was stolen yet again. The bottom panel on the back door had been chiseled out and there was a bloody axe found in the backyard. Unfortunately, Joseph Romano would pass 2 days later, but this attack would be one that would change this entire case because the public now knew not only who to look for, but that there was someone to look for. And so tips began coming in with people saying they'd seen this person and that they were just scared. Everybody was just terrified and wanted this person to be caught. One man even shot at his back door after hearing a sound, and when the police got there, they found a chisel at the back door, but unfortunately he hadn't shot anybody. There hadn't been any blood or anything around the area. And it would be approximately 7 months before another murder would happen. This was thought to be because there was a group of men who would go out with weapons, with guns, at night to protect their family. They would get together and they would just patrol the neighborhoods looking out for anybody who could disturb anyone. And it seemed to work until March 10th of 1919. It was the corner of Jefferson Avenue and 2nd Street across from the Mississippi River. There lived the Cortamaglia family, and this consisted of Charles, Rosie, and their baby Mary. And unfortunately, this time the neighbors would hear the attacks but would get there too late to save the baby Mary, who was struck in the back of the neck and killed almost instantly. Charles and Rosie did go to the hospital though. They had both been bludgeoned at the skull, but they were still conscious. And when investigators got there, that they found that there wasn't a robbery once again. The back door did have a panel chiseled out, and there was a bloody axe in the backyard. And although this fit this certain Axeman of New Orleans, when Rosie awoke, she said that she knew exactly who had done it. And it was her neighbor who had found them and called the police. His name was Lorlando Giordano, and he was the one who killed her baby and attacked them, or so she said. Now, investigators had a hard time believing this because Lorlando was 69 at the time, and Rosie had also said that his son Frank was with them and helped in the attack, and his son was an 18-year-old who was 6 feet tall, 200 pounds, and would have had to fit through that tiny back panel. And although investigators weren't really sure that this was what occurred, it didn't necessarily make sense, Rosie was very sure of her statement, and they were charged with murder. Except when Charles divorced Rosie after denying that this is ever what happened, she finally admitted a year later that it was a false statement, that she was just angry and basically wanted someone to blame. And they were released. 3 days after that attack would be the first time that the public would hear from the Axeman himself. He sent a letter to the Times-Picayune that was addressed from hell. And it read, "They have never caught me, and they never will. They have never seen me, for I am invisible, even as the ether that surrounds your earth. I am not a human being, but a spirit and a demon from the hottest hell. I am what you Orleanians and your foolish police call the Axeman. When I see fit, I shall come and claim other victims. I alone know whom they shall be. I shall leave no clue except my bloody axe, besmeared with blood and brains of he whom I have sent below to keep me company. If you wish, you may tell the police to be careful not to rile me. Of course I am a responsible spirit. I take no offense at the way they have conducted their investigations in the past. In fact, they have been so utterly stupid as to not only amuse me, but the satanic majesty Francis Joseph Otez. But tell them to beware. Let them not try to discover what I am, for it were better that they were never born than to incur the wrath of the Axeman. I don't think that there is any need of such a warning, for I feel sure the police will always dodge me as they always have in the past. They are wise and know how to keep away from all harm. Undoubtedly, you Orleanians think of me as a most horrible murderer, which I am, but I could be much worse if I wanted to. If I wished, I could pay a visit to your city every night. At will, I could slay thousands of your best citizens, and the worst, for I am in close relationship with the angel of death. Now, to be exact, at 12:15 earthly time on next Tuesday night, I am going to pass over New Orleans. In my infinite mercy, I am going to make a little proposition to you people. Here it is. I am very fond of jazz music, and I swear by all the devils in the nether regions that every person shall be spared in whose home a jazz band is in full swing at the time I have just mentioned. If everyone has a jazz band going, well, then, so much the better for you people. One thing is certain, and that is that some of your people who do not jazz it out on that specific Tuesday night, if there be any, will get the axe. Well, as I am cold and crave the warmth of my native Tartarus, and it's about time I leave your earthly home, I will cease my discourse, hoping that thou wilt publish this, that it may go well with thee. I have been, am, and will be the worst spirit that ever existed, either in fact or realm of fancy. From the Axeman. And because of this letter, music was played everywhere. If people didn't have a record player in their homes to play jazz music, they went to community halls, dance halls, and all gathered around to hear live jazz music to keep them under protection. And the night of March 19th, there was no attacks that occurred. It would be 5 months later, on August 10th, that the next attack would occur of a grocer named Steve Boca, who was asleep in his home when he saw a dark figure looming over him. He was hit twice, but after regaining consciousness, he actually ran out into the road, kind of disoriented, looking around, and thankfully got to a neighbor's house before collapsing, because he didn't really realize what had happened, that he had been attacked, until he had reached up and felt the blood and immediately ran to the neighbors. Back at Steve's home, there had been no robbery, but the back panel on the back door had been chiseled out once again, and thankfully Steve Boca did survive the attack. But a month later, another would occur. It was September 3rd, and Sarah Lawman, a 19-year-old living alone in an apartment, hadn't been seen for a few days by her neighbors. And they started to get really worried, so they went to knock on the door, and when no one answered, they broke in and found her in bed, covered in blood, missing several teeth. This attacker this time had come through an open window, but there was a bloody axe found in the front yard. Sarah unfortunately did not survive the attack and couldn't tell them anything. The next month, on October 27th, Mike Pepitone was home with his wife and 6 children. And that night, his wife, Esther, had actually heard a struggle at about 1 in the morning and went out into the hallway. She was not in the room with her husband at the time. She went out in the hallway and saw 2 men fleeing her home. When she got into Mike's room, she saw blood splatter all over the walls and on him. When investigators got there, they noticed how calm Esther was, and she said that she believed it was the Axeman who had attacked Mike, and that she had seen the intruders leave but didn't really know any of their descriptive features and couldn't tell them anything about the people who she had seen flee. None of these attacks have ever been solved, and most of them had the same MO. They had the panels cut out in the doors, they had victims that the axe belonged to, and all of their ethnicities seemed to have a common factor too, because they all appeared to be either Italian immigrants or Italian Americans who owned grocery stores. But just when everyone had thought that the attacks had stopped after Mike Pepitone, had they really moved elsewhere? You see, in December of 1920, a man named Joseph Mumfree was shot to death. Joseph had previously lived in New Orleans and was now shot to death with a woman standing over him named Miss Esther Pepitone. This was the 2nd anniversary of her husband, Mike Pepitone's murder. When the police arrived, she just calmly told police that this was the man who had murdered her husband and would obviously link back in New Orleans to being the Axeman. And Joseph Mumfree kind of checked out as a convict because he had been in jail several times, including a long period of time between 1912 and 1918, and the attacks had started up again in 1918 when he got out. What I didn't tell you was that there were attacks that had happened previous to the 1918-1919 attacks that people often thought were connected, and those were in 1911, which was the year before Joseph Mumfree would go to prison. You see, these attacks that happened 7 years prior to the ones we talked about earlier were also done with an axe and ended with several people being killed, including a Miss Toni Shebra, who was murdered on May 12th of 1912. Do you remember that little note written on the sidewalk after the first attack had happened? Miss Maggio will sit up tonight, just like Miss Toni. Was this the Miss Toni that person was referring to, connecting the attacks in 1918 to the attacks in 1911 and 1912? And there was a suspect in Toni Shebra's case, and guess what his name was? Joseph Mumfree. So it almost makes perfect sense that he started the attacks as the Axeman way back in 1911. He got arrested for another thing in 1912. He stayed in prison for 7 years, and when he got out in 1918, began right away and wasn't caught until Esther Pepitone shot him to death. Joseph was also found to be a leader of a blackmailing gang who targeted Italians. But another theory pointed to another man named Jake Byrd, who would be arrested in 1947. It was October 30th in Tacoma, Washington, and Bertha Klutt and Beverly June were murdered in their home with an axe. And Jake Byrd was seen running from their house, and the police actually caught him. He went down with a fight, but they caught him and brought him in, where he confessed to murdering them, and also to murdering 44 other people across the country. He was 45 at the time he was arrested, which would have made him a teen at the time of the Axeman murders, and he did live in New Orleans at that time. Something that's really thought to connect Jake Byrd to the Axeman case is the fact that at trial, Jake Byrd stood up before he was about to be convicted of murder and said that everyone in the room would die before him. And before he was ever put to death, 6 men of that room died, 5 of a heart attack, 1 of pneumonia, and that was known as the Jake Byrd hex. And many believed that what he said and how he presented himself as some high spirit of some sort that could put a hex on someone made people believe that he could have written the Axeman letter, because it was all about having this high mighty power above people that could take lives whenever he wanted. He did confess to 44 murders and did never confess to being the Axeman, although, I mean, he could have wanted to hold that over people's heads that he hadn't said everything, but also if he confessed to so many, why not tell them about the Axeman murders? Maybe those were included in the 44. Who really knows? Another theory is that the murders that happened after that 7-month period where the people were all out paroling for so long and there was no murders and then there was attacks again, some believe that after that was just copycat killers and that that wasn't actually the original Axeman. However, this Axeman never really had a set schedule. He set to, sometimes he went months, sometimes weeks, but could he have been in jail during that 7-month period and that's why he took such long of a break? Who knows? The killer is still unknown, but who do you believe is responsible? Any of the suspects I named, anyone that you know of, or just another theory in general you've thought of while listening? And do you think that the Axeman actually did write the letter, or if it was just someone trying to get attention, or it was some jazz musician that just wanted his music out? But I seem to think that the letter from the Axeman had an air of confidence that the murders themselves lacked. I felt like the letter kind of said, oh, I am above all, I am so powerful, no one can touch me. And yet if you look at the murders, some of the attacks weren't even successful. In fact, a lot of them weren't. These people survived, and it seemed like going in with an axe, you're not just trying to harm someone, you're trying to murder them. It seems to me like this Axeman either went in and got too scared to finish the job after one blow, or maybe got too tired after that one blow and couldn't finish it, and just never really made sure that the victims were actually dead. From the letter, you wouldn't get that. You would think that he was right on time, right at his target, making sure that these people didn't have a chance. And then I got to thinking, if that's the case, what kind of person can do that? Can seem like such a confident, arrogant, cocky person on paper or with words, and yet not in person embody this and really have the personality of that. And yes, that can be lots of different people. It could also be a teenage boy, just a teenager in general, who often thinks that they are so high and mighty until they're actually doing it. And could that lead to Jake Byrd? He would also be small enough to fit through the panel of the door that he would cut out. Some people have said that, you know, it would have to have been someone super small to fit through the small panels. They could have, of course, reached up and kind of twisted the doorknob and gotten in too, I think, but some believe they just really cut that out to go through it, which would have been the size of a small, frail teenage boy. I don't know, because there's a lot of evidence for Joseph Mumfree as well, and this case is just insane, mainly because of the letter that was sent and so many things that don't even add up and could possibly not even relate to this case at all. But I'd love to hear your theories on this one, and I think it may be one of the strangest letters that has ever been sent from a serial killer. I mean, I've read some really strange ones, but this one was just way, way up there. So don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay, bye.